Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Carol Sandhu. I'm your travel-sized qualified legal advisor here to help level the playing field by simplifying and explaining life's most common legal challenges. Today we're tackling an important topic for tenants and landlords alike. When can your landlord raise rent and by how much? Now, landlord and tenant law has seen a lot of change recently, and many people simply do not understand their rights as a tenant, and many landlords don't understand their obligations under the new law. However, if you pay attention to the advice I'm about to give you today, you can prevent disputes and ensure a fair rental experience for both parties. So the video is going to go like this. Firstly, I'll discuss the circumstances whereby your landlord can raise your rent, followed by an explanation on how much they can increase it. I will then teach you how to effectively challenge an unfair rent increase before finally finishing off with some very important tips and tricks for tenants and landlords alike. So let's get started. First, let's understand the basics. Rent increases are governed by specific laws and regulations which vary depending on the type of tenancy agreement that you have and the country or region that you're in. In the UK, the rules are different for assured short-hold tenancies, regulated tenancies, and assured tenancies. Today, we'll mainly focus on assured short-hold tenancies, ASTs, as they are by far the most common form of private tenancy in England and Wales. So when can your landlord raise your rent? Let's firstly consider a fixed term tenancy. Now, a fixed term tenancy is one that will expire after a fixed and agreed term, not one, for example, that is rolling year by year or month by month. Now, if you have a fixed term tenancy, your rent is typically fixed for the duration of that term. This means that your landlord cannot raise your rent until the fixed term ends, unless there is a rent review clause in your tenancy agreement. Now, a rent review clause allows for rent increases at specified times during the term, but the clause must be clear and fair, and any increase must be in line with what is stated in the agreement. So your first step is to review your AST agreement that you signed before commencing your tenancy to determine if such a clause exists and what increase is allowed. So that is during a fixed term tenancy. Now let's look at the end of a fixed term tenancy, because at the end of your fixed term tenancy, your landlord can propose a new rent amount for the renewal of that tenancy. Now, if you agree to the new rent, you can sign a new tenancy agreement with the revised rent amount. Now, if you do not agree, you can negotiate with your landlord at this point or just choose to move out. Your bargaining power, however, will depend on whether you've been a good tenant and how difficult it will be for your landlord to replace you without a gap. Now, if you've been a good paying tenant, landlords can be reluctant to risk new tenancies, particularly if your landlord doesn't have a large tenant pool to choose from. So you may be able to negotiate little to no rental increase. Remember, landlords will often try their luck with rental increases, and it's okay to challenge that. Now, the third time a landlord can increase your rent is during a periodic tenancy. Now, a periodic tenancy is a rolling contract that continues on week by week or month by month after your initial fixed term has ended. Now, during an indefinite tenancy like this, your tenancy agreement should say how often the rent can be reviewed and how it will be increased. If the tenancy agreement doesn't say when the rent can go up, the landlord can propose a rent rise to you for mutual agreement. Please note, your landlord cannot propose to increase the rent on this type of tenancy without providing you proper notice. Now, in England, for example, your landlord must give you at least 1 month's notice if you pay rent weekly or monthly. If you pay rent yearly, the landlord must give you 6 months notice at least, and cannot increase the rent within that first year. Now, the fourth way in which your landlord can increase your rent is by mutual agreement. Of course, if both parties agree, you and your landlord can agree to a rent increase at any point in the tenancy. Perhaps if there's been no rental increase in a very long time, the landlord can approach you reasonably and say, hey, market rent has gone up, landlord's costs have gone up, I need to increase your rent. Although this is your choice as a tenant whether you accept, if you don't compromise at all, this will likely not mean that your landlord is going to renew your tenancy at the end of the term. If you can reach an agreement, this should be documented in writing to avoid any future disputes. It's important to communicate openly and ensure that both parties are clear about these new terms. Okay, so now we are clear on the different circumstances in which your landlord can increase your rent, depending on your type of tenancy. And now we're going to consider how much can your landlord raise your rent by. So number one, market rent. The amount which your landlord can increase your rent largely depends on the market rent. So the market rent is the amount that similar properties in your area are renting for. Now, your landlord cannot raise your rent to an unreasonably high amount that is out of line with comparable properties in the area. It must be fair and reflect current market conditions. Number two, a rent review clause. Now, as discussed previously, if your tenancy agreement has in it a rent review clause, that clause will specify how much the rent can be increased by and when. Now, this could be based on one, a fixed percentage, or it can be an increase in line with inflation or another agreed upon method. Number three is rent increases for regulated tenancies. Now, although I've been discussing up until now ASTs, which are the most common form of tenancy, for regulated tenancies, i.e. tenancies that began before 15th of January 1989, these are called regulated tenancies, the rent increases are strictly controlled. So your landlord must apply to the rent officer to increase the rent, and the new rent must be registered. The increase is typically in line with inflation and local rent levels. And finally, we're going to look at our other type of tenancy, which is assured tenancies. Now, for assured tenancies, those are tenancies that began after January 15th, 1989, but before February 28th, 1997. Rent increases are also regulated, and your landlord can only propose a new rent by serving a Section 13 notice. But you have the right to challenge the increase if you believe it's unfair. Now, the Rent Assessment Committee, which we will look at later, will review the proposed rent and decide if it's reasonable based on market rates. Okay, so to summarise, now we have discussed the different circumstances by which your landlord can increase your rent depending on your type of tenancy. And we've also considered all the factors which determine how much your landlord can increase your rent by, again, depending on the different types of tenancy. Now we're going to move on to a really important section, which is legal limitations and restrictions. Guys, very important point to note, the following legal restriction on landlords. There are legal limitations on how much your landlord can increase your rent by. They cannot increase your rent as a form of retaliation, discrimination, or harassment. Any increase must be fair and transparent and in line with the terms of your tenancy agreement and local laws. Okay, so with that out of the way, you now know each of the different circumstances within which your landlord can request a rent increase and for which different tenancy type. The correct legal method will primarily depend on your tenancy type, but will often boil down to what was in your agreement or what is fair and reasonable in the economic landscape. Now let's move on to how to challenge. So how to challenge an unfair rent increase. If you believe your landlord's proposed rent increase is unfair, there are steps you can take to challenge it. Number one, first step is to gather your evidence. So first and foremost, gather evidence that supports your case. This includes local market rent research. So research and document the current market rent for similar properties in your area. Websites like Rightmove, Zoopla, or local estate agents can provide this information. Next, communication. So keep all written communications with your landlord safe and documented regarding the rent increase, including emails, letters, text messages. Next, document the condition of the property. So if the property is in disrepair or lacks amenities that justify that new increased rent, then take photos and keep records of the existing state of the property. Now, the next step is to begin negotiations with the landlord. So begin discussing the increase with your landlord, do your research, as I stated above, and provide your evidence of local rent prices for similar properties to your landlord and explain why you believe the increase is unreasonable. If your landlord is claiming inflation, propose evidence to show that the increase is not in line with the level of inflation being experienced. Open communication can often resolve disputes without the need for formal action. Your next step will be to try and contact your local council. So if negotiation isn't working, contact your local council's housing department. They can provide advice and support and may be able to mediate the situation themselves. Finally, you could apply to the first tier tribunal, the property tribunal. If you're still unable to reach an agreement with your landlord, you can apply to the first tier property tribunal for a rent assessment. You can do this quite simply yourself or hire a local solicitor to help you. The tribunal will then review the proposed increase and determine if it's fair. Here's how the process works. You submit an application. You'll need to fill out the appropriate forms, which can be found on the government's website, and I will link them down below in the description. Include all your evidence and a detailed explanation of why you believe the rent increase is unfair. The tribunal will review your application and may schedule a hearing where both you and the landlord can present your cases. And as for a decision, the tribunal will make their decision based on the evidence and the market conditions as I've discussed. If they agree with you, they may set a new fair rent amount. My final advice is to seek legal advice, though. If you are unsure about your rights or the best course of action, seek legal advice. A solicitor specialising in housing law can provide really good guidance and represent you in negotiations or tribunal proceedings. Again, many lawyers offer free initial consultations, and you can get a good idea of your chances just from your free initial consultation. So now you should be aware of not only the circumstances in which your landlord can increase your rent, but the steps by which you can challenge such a decision, neither of which are particularly long or drawn out options. Now, before we finish, let me give you some really quick tips and tricks of the trade for all tenants. Number one, read your tenancy agreement carefully. Before agreeing a new tenancy agreement with your landlord or signing an extension, read it thoroughly and ensure you understand all the terms, including any clauses related to rent increases, so that this doesn't happen to you again. If you're unsure about any terms, seek clarification from your landlord or a legal advisor. Second tip is to maintain records. Keep all records of communications with your landlord regarding rent increases, including emails, letters, and notes from phone conversations. Keep hold of them just in case. This documentation can be crucial if you need to challenge an increase in the future. The third tip is to keep staying informed. Stay informed about local rent prices and market conditions. This knowledge can help you determine if a proposed rent increase in the future is reasonable and provide evidence to support your case if you need to challenge it again. That concludes this video. Remember, by being informed about your rights and obligations, you can navigate rent increases fairly and effectively, preventing disputes and ensuring you get a positive rental experience and a fair rental amount. Now, if you've learned or taken anything of value from this video today, maybe drop me a like or even subscribe to my channel to ensure that you have qualified legal advice in your back pocket at all times. Remember, while my content can and should be taken as reliable legal advice in general, this content is not a substitute for specific legal advice as it relates to your particular situation, and so should not be relied upon alone. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.